Pink-haired woman staggered and clenched the tiny recruit tightly in her hand as the crowd pressed in. The crowd pressed in as a looming attacker swung hard beneath ragged breathing. On the rooftop, blonde woman and red-haired woman peered down, then agreed to follow. The tiny recruit fell toward the street, and a dark monster seized the small body. The figure demanded the child be given, and pink-haired woman screamed out loud. Pink-haired woman reached a landing and watched the corridor collapse into frantic noise. The cult leader shouted from the center, while masked figures surged through the crowd. Screams and crashing metal tore the air as people were shoved aside. The tiny recruit slipped free and fell toward the street amid the press. A dark monster seized the small body and demanded it be handed over. A silver-costumed hero lunged from the crowd and snatched the child midair. Pink-haired woman screamed while bystanders scattered, and two women prepared to follow. The child cried out and clung before the rescue pulled them clear. Pink-haired woman reached a landing and watched chaos unfold below. A dark monster lunged at the tiny recruit while a soccer ball flew. The costumed hero intercepted and seized the child midair, blocking the strike. The monster snarled threats while bystanders shouted and scattered. Two nearby women decided to follow the rescuers from a distance. From a rooftop, hooded figures watched and smiled, then slipped back into shadow. Masked figures and the cult leader regrouped and prepared to move through the crowd. Nearby, the cult leader handed a sealed envelope to a suited man and demanded proof. Grinning man leaned forward, his sunglasses hiding a cold smile. The blonde woman recoiled, then lunged forward, shouting, and flung her hood aside. She cursed and ran toward the stairwell, palms slamming a heavy door. Behind the door, a corridor glowed red as something struck through darkness with brutal force. The impact filled the stairwell with shadow and the sound of tearing flesh, while a hooded figure and masked figures paused and watched through the glass. Nearby, the cult leader had already handed a sealed envelope and demanded proof. The hooded figure and masked figures moved through the stairwell toward the glass door. They burst through, and the grinning assailant smiled with violent menace openly. Blood spattered, and a red dress was dragged toward the open shaft. The blonde woman and red-haired woman cried and stumbled away in horror. Someone clutched a torn mask, then toppled from the landing into darkness. A survivor screamed, "Go to hell," and shouted "Horse King" in disbelief as chaos consumed the landing. Nearby, the cult leader had already handed a sealed envelope and demanded proof from those present. The hooded figure and masked figures moved down the stairwell and burst through the glass door onto the landing. A grinning assailant stood high above, smiling with violent menace as blood spattered around him. Red fabric trailed toward an open shaft while someone clutched a torn mask and toppled into darkness. Survivors screamed, "Go to hell," and chanted, "Die, die, die," as panic spread. Voices accused Horse King of leading a cult and demanded a sacrificial offering to their king of hell. Nearby, the cult leader had already passed a sealed envelope and demanded proof from those assembled. The hooded figure and masked figures moved down the stairwell and burst through the glass doors onto the landing. A grinning assailant climbed above the crowd and raised a knife. He slashed downward, and blood spattered across the stage. Red fabric trailed toward an open shaft as someone clutched a torn mask and toppled into darkness. Survivors screamed and chanted, "Die, die, die," while voices accused Horse King of leading the cult and demanded a sacrificial offering. The pink-haired woman watched, stunned, as violence consumed the hall. Nearby, the cult leader had already given a sealed envelope and demanded proof. The hooded figure and masked figures moved down the stairwell and burst outward. A grinning assailant climbed above the crowd and slashed with a knife. Blood spattered the stage, and red fabric trailed toward an open shaft. Someone clutched a torn mask and toppled into darkness as survivors screamed. Voices chanted, "Die, die, die," while accusing Horse King and demanding a sacrifice. The pink-haired woman stood stunned and watched violence consume the hall. Nearby, the cult leader had already handed a sealed envelope and demanded proof. The hooded figure and masked figures streamed down the stairwell and burst into the hall. A grinning assailant climbed above the crowd and slashed. Blood spattered the stage and red fabric trailed toward an open shaft. Someone clutched a torn mask and toppled into darkness as survivors screamed. Voices chanted "Die, die, die" while accusing Horse King and calling for a sacrifice. The pink-haired woman stood stunned and watched violence consume the hall while a blonde woman laughed and praised her brother, and the stage performers were hailed as the real heroes. The hooded figure and masked figures streamed down the stairwell and burst into the hall. A grinning assailant climbed above the crowd and slashed the performers. Blood spattered the stage. Someone clutched a torn mask and toppled into an open shaft while survivors screamed. Voices chanted "Die, die, die" and accused Horse King, calling for a human sacrifice. The pink-haired woman stood stunned as the blonde woman laughed and praised her brother. On stage, a costumed hero screamed and continued manic chants before collapsing in agony. The sequence cut outward to a rooftop, the city lights, and a distant Earth. A control room monitor displayed a holographic map as a silhouetted figure watched. The cap figure's wide grin filled a final close-up and implied an unseen plan. After the hall collapsed into chaos, the sequence pulled outward beyond the city. It continued past rooftops into a starfield where Earth hung small and blue. A luminescent cube of circuitry drifted nearby, its surfaces traced by active conduits. Plates of light ran along its faces and cast shifting beams onto scattered debris. The image broadened the scene from a staged attack to a wider reach beyond the planet. The cap figure's earlier grin had hinted at a plan. Now a vast device suggested its scale and intent. After the staged attack had broadened beyond the city, the focus snapped back to a crowded street where a man tossed a small blue canister. It burst into bright pink crystalline shards that struck faces and eyes. People screamed as pain and blindness spread. One man laughed and provoked the victims, while others surged to chase and subdue him. A newcomer tried to corral the fleeing crowd. Someone asked who the attackers were. In the last moment, a pink-haired woman's eye went wide, and a single whispered word cut through the din: "Reconnected." Mocking laughter filled the cramped set as a grinning man jeered at bystanders. The view cut to a theatrical poster with the monstrous band's name on display. A woman in a cap sneered and dismissed them as pathetic losers. Then men lunged forward, violence erupted and overturned a nearby table swiftly. One man was thrown down and pinned while others begged for mercy. A blue electric flare streaked across a rising fighter's eye as he bared teeth. An injured man gasped a warning, urged movement, and then the hall fell quiet. Two faces locked in a blunt stare, and a voice finally said, "Excuse me." Pink-haired woman's eye widened with whispered recognition, cutting through the din. Mocking laughter had echoed across the cramped set, while a grinning man taunted the crowd. The camera cut to a poster that shouted the monstrous band's name. A cap-wearing woman sneered and brushed them off. Men surged and overturned a table. One attacker was shoved down and pinned, while others pleaded. A blue electric flare lit a fighter's eye as he bared his teeth. An injured man gasped a warning, and the hall fell silent. Two faces locked in a blunt stare until a voice interrupted. The pink-haired woman stepped forward, and recognition widened her eyes. She reached out offering help, and the scene softened into relieved applause. A small group argued as a leader counted the living and taunted the crowd. He held up the survivors and said others had given their lives for them. The scene tightened to a mouth shot of the pink-haired woman, then cut to a cap figure who traded a knowing line with a companion. A blue-haired girl reacted with visible delight and embarrassment. Private smiles replaced the earlier jeers. The page closed on a single person, musing about when those events had first begun. After the earlier counting and taunts, violence flared again. A hooded figure was shoved backward into a bench and tumbled down steps. He hit the floor hard while men circled and laughed. The hooded figure curled, then snapped, baring teeth and sweating as fury took hold. He shouted at a nearby youth while a man in a green shirt mocked him openly. The assailant kept provoking and pushing until the hooded figure's face split into a wild grin. The page lingered on that grin and the mocking voice nearby. After earlier taunts, the hooded figure had been shoved into a bench and downstairs. He curled, then snapped, and showed a toothy grin at his mockers. He shouted at Man 2, while Man 1 in a green shirt mocked him loudly. The crowd closed in and laughed as the hooded figure surged toward the youth. He struck Man 2 and sent him tumbling down the concrete steps while others jeered. The hooded figure broke free, crossed to the Easy Gym building, entered the stairwell, and collapsed at a landing gasping. After earlier taunts, the hooded figure had collapsed at the stair, landing gasping and hunched. A broad man in a yellow shirt, the gym guy, seized him and smiled smugly. The gym guy mocked the hooded figure and forced him onto the cold concrete. He leaned close and told him he could not be loved while grinning. The hooded figure shook, blood and tears streaked his face as he sobbed. A blonde woman arrived, shouting and demanding answers from the watching crowd and attacker. After collapsing gasping at the stair landing, the hooded figure lay hunched and trembling. The gym guy seized him and forced him down onto the cold concrete while mocking him. Bystanders circled and laughed, pointing and jeering as they made a spectacle of him. A blonde woman arrived and shouted demands, but the crowd kept trading insults and dares. They called attention to a man they taunted as the Horse King and laughed louder. The hooded figure sobbed and insisted he remained himself despite their shouts and threats. Gym guy grinned and urged them to enjoy it, treating cruelty like a game. After the crowd had jeered and pointed, the hooded figure collapsed on the concrete again. Gym guy seized him and yanked his hair, forcing his face up and yelling. The mob circled as Gym guy shoved food into the hooded figure's mouth and ate beside him. A sudden struggle sent figures into shadow, and someone grabbed a heavy tire iron from nearby. The hooded figure's eye widened at the raised weapon as bystanders shouted. He screamed as metal fell and pierced flesh, spraying blood and panic. Faces in the blood blurred into grinning, chanting phantoms that called out happiness and laughter. After the earlier humiliation, the hooded figure remained on the pavement while a woman watched and smiled. She spoke softly about being watched and then crouched, her grin calm. The crowd's brutality flared when a man seized a heavy iron and drove it into the hooded figure, blood spraying and cries breaking out. Red streaks cut across the night as sirens and panic rose. Nearby people stared in stunned silence. Later, a small group sat in a dim room and watched images on a screen, whispering and unable to look away. Pink-haired woman had strained to see as the night deepened and rain slicked the road. A massive translucent pyramid formed above the skyline, its surface streaming like living code and casting cold blue light. Bystanders on the street stopped and whispered, voices failing as people pointed and shouted questions. A small group of viewers huddled in a dim room and watched the live feed, mouths tight, eyes fixed. Red-haired man stepped forward, tried to explain, then his words broke into panicked disbelief. The pyramid released a concentrated column of energy that slammed into the pavement, throwing bodies and leaving stunned faces in its wake. The pyramid had loomed, and its energy column had slammed into the pavement. Bystanders froze, and red-haired man's careful explanation dissolved into panicked disbelief among witnesses. A small group of viewers watched the live feed, lips tight, eyes fixed on screens. Amid chaos, a bizarre costumed figure emerged and smiled with unnatural glee. A label under the figure named it Commander S and showed its rank. A man nearby laughed and suggested they marry and harvest, prompting uneasy, nervous laughter. The crowd's mood slipped from awe to anxious curiosity as the creature danced. Analysts watching the feed concluded the apparition defied classification and posed new threats. An unseen voice warned these were not the monsters the city had faced before. The pyramid had loomed, and its energy column slammed into the pavement. Bystanders froze as red-haired man's careful explanation dissolved into panicked disbelief. A small group of viewers watched the live feed with tight lips. Amid the chaos, a bizarre costumed figure emerged and smiled with unnatural glee, Labels identified it as Commander S and displayed its rank. A nearby man laughed and suggested they marry and harvest, prompting uneasy laughter. Analysts watching the feed concluded the apparition defied classification and posed new threats. An unseen voice warned these were not the monsters the city had faced before. A brutal speaker declared the parasitic farming had failed and vowed to exterminate them all, while others moved on rooftops, and a dark figure taunted the crowd with a final question. After the pyramid's energy column erupted, red-haired man confronted a squat green monster atop a ruined rooftop. The monster sneered and fired a crackling blast, while red-haired man blocked and answered with a hard kick that scattered debris. They traded strikes and rapid counters across the roof as distant bystanders and viewers watched frozen. The monster taunted about eradication and lunged with a savage bite. Red-haired man braced, drove a counterattack, and forced the creature back. The monster then vaulted away into the dark sky, leaving the crowd to absorb the shock. After the earlier clash ended with the monster's retreat, the rooftop fight resumed under dusk. Two costumed fighters launched a coordinated dumbbell tackle that slammed a striped assailant through rafters. The attackers exchanged boasts and declared Mega dead was not a band of weak men. Allies rallied, and one cheered his comrades, promising to finish the remaining threats. A rival then shouted he would take the target and revealed Horse King's arrival. Horse King advanced clenched fist and charged his signature Horse King punch at a tiny red target. After Horse King's punch connected, a vertical blast erupted through the rooftop. Debris and energy drove upward in a jagged column that shattered rafters and concrete. Bystanders screamed and leaped away as the structure collapsed around them. The tiny red target was caught in the blast and thrown clear. Several people on the roof froze into stone-like statues amid falling rubble. A wider shockwave raced across the city streets below, and panicked crowds gathered in the distance. On the ground, an injured person groaned and called for help, asking others to call an ambulance and tend the wounded. After the rooftop blast, chaos continued as survivors scrambled through shattered beams and dust. A bystander shouted at Dave as a dark hand lunged from the debris to seize a man. A collapsed figure froze into a stone form, while a close eye reflected a distant globe. A slim projectile arced through the sky as the creature pulled itself upright. Its massive hand rose and drew rubble upward. Rocks hovered, then fell in a rain of concrete. A bloodied woman curled beneath the stones on the street. Crowds screamed as pink-haired woman, blonde woman, and red-haired woman recoiled in shock. The monster's maw opened, and a blinding orb formed inside its throat. White light and shards of energy burst outward, cutting a beam through the air. A dark hand lunged from the wreckage and snatched at a collapsing figure below. A bloodied blonde woman curled beneath falling concrete and covered her head. Pink-haired woman recoiled and staggered back, stunned momentarily by the brutal display. Man one froze with wide eyes and watched the scene in horror. Dusk clouded the skyline as distant sirens wailed across the ruined street. The monster's maw opened, and a blinding orb formed inside its throat. White light and shards burst outward and cut a beam. A dark hand lunged from wreckage and snatched a collapsing figure below. A bloodied blonde woman curled beneath falling concrete and covered her head. Pink-haired woman recoiled and staggered back, stunned. Man one froze with wide eyes as dust clouded the skyline. Survivors shouted at a nearby man and called him leader. Flashbacks showed the leader comforting the blonde woman while smiling. The flashbacks ended on a ruined corpse revealed on the street. The blonde woman screamed for her brother. The crowd screamed, and two men called the leader's name amid chaos. The monster's maw opened, and a blinding orb formed deep in its throat. White light and shards burst outward and cut a beam through the street. A dark hand lunged from wreckage and snatched a collapsing figure from below. Horse King launched into the light and struck the beam with a heavy blow. The impact sent shards and dust while the blonde woman curled and screamed. A watcher on a nearby rooftop smiled and whispered "Oh ho" as eyes narrowed. The crowd screamed while two men shouted the leader's name amid falling debris. The monster opened its maw and formed a blinding orb deep in its throat. White light and shards burst outward and cut a beam through the street. A dark hand reached from wreckage and pulled a collapsing figure free. Horse King launched into the light and struck the beam with a heavy blow. Shards and dust flew, and the blonde woman curled and screamed. A man then tore through the lingering light and charged, energy trailing his limbs. He struck downward, scattering arcs of power and knocking a figure aside. Pink-haired woman stared in shock and watched the light spread. Horse King struck down into the lingering light and shattered the blasted street with a single, brutal motion. A man was launched backward by the impact, and his scream snapped off as blood spattered the pavement. Energy arcs carved through rubble and sent attackers reeling. Dust and shattered glass swept the scene while bystanders fell back. The air filled with ringing and the taste of metal. Pink-haired woman stared, frozen a moment, then finally called out Horse King's name, her voice thin against the collapse and continuing chaos. After Horse King's downward strike, the street broke and attackers scattered under raw force. A man arced through the air and crashed face first, blood splattering across concrete. Nearby assailants were thrown back by sweeping energy arcs and slammed into rubble. Dust and glass spun through the light while witnesses fell and scrambled. A shocked voice cried out "Bro," as a small green creature peered from the debris with curious focus. Pink-haired woman pushed forward and scanned the ruin for survivors amid the ringing. One wounded figure staggered up, then limped away through the fractured wreck. Horse King's downward strike split the street and hurled attackers into rubble. One man arced through the air and slammed face first into concrete. Dust and shattered glass spun through noon light while witnesses scrambled for cover. A small green creature peered from debris and curiously examined the chaos. It gathered an orbiting flare and tested the force with a mocking laugh. A wounded man staggered up, then roared, channeling energy into a bleeding fist. Pink-haired woman pushed forward and scanned the ruin for survivors amid ringing alarms. Before she could reach them, a crimson beam tore across the street, scattering bystanders. Attention snapped to a returning figure named Yura as power flared around him. Horse King's downward strike had broken the avenue, and witnesses still reeled as Yura's power flared. Pink-haired woman pushed through smoke and urged survivors to flee toward safer ground. A towering crystalline construct unfolded midair and flooded the ruins with blue light. The small green cat probed the energy and then mocked its weakness while testing a gathered flare. Masked figures readied weapons behind the construct as tension tightened. A harsh order cut through alarms: get rid of them all. The attackers surged through the light and the crowd scattered beneath falling shards. A crystalline construct had unfolded above the avenue and poured cold blue light across the ruins. The light flared into a sudden blast that scattered debris and stunned onlookers. Pink-haired woman pushed through the glare and drove survivors toward safer ground. Masked figures broke from cover and rushed the crowd with coordinated strikes. Red energy blades arced through the attackers and shredded armor as several assailants collapsed. A voice screamed a warning, "Yura dodge." The shout cut through alarms and a silver-haired figure recoiled, eyes wide, as shards and afterglow rained around them. A crystalline construct unfolded above the avenue and poured blue light across the ruins. The light flared into a blast that scattered debris and stunned onlookers. Pink-haired woman pushed through glare and drove survivors to safety. Masked figures broke cover and rushed the crowd. Red energy blades arced and shredded assailant armor. A voice screamed, "Yura dodge," and Yura recoiled as shards rained. A yellow beam lanced the scene and cut an assailant, spraying blood across the street. Survivors scattered and boots pounded pavement. A man in glasses waved promotional cards and barked into a mic. Smiling woman stepped forward and then sagged, clutching a wound as blood soaked her side. Pink-haired woman kept guiding survivors through smoke. A crystalline construct had split the avenue and stunned many witnesses earlier that day. Masked figures had surged, and red energy blades had shredded assailant armor moments before. Then a furious man with glasses erupted, screaming that his fan had been scratched. He vowed he could not forgive and lunged into the chaos without restraint. He launched burning strikes with armored limbs and boots that spat orange fire. The blasts tore through the street and sent bodies and debris flying. Crowds screamed as flames licked clothing and blood spattered near collapsed bystanders. He roared orders and cursed his victims before a final blast shattered the scene. Silence followed the concussion, and survivors scrambled away through smoke and falling ash. A crystalline construct had split the avenue earlier and left witnesses stunned and scattered. Masked figures had surged, and red blades had shredded assailant armor moments before. Then a furious man with glasses erupted and charged into the carnage. He launched burning strikes with armored limbs and boots that spat orange fire. The blasts tore through the street and sent bodies and debris flying. Crowds screamed as flames licked clothing and blood spattered near collapsed bystanders. He roared orders and cursed his victims before a final blast shattered the scene. Silence followed the concussion, and survivors scrambled through smoke and falling ash. Earlier, a crystalline construct had torn the avenue and left survivors scattered. Masked figures had surged, and red blades had shredded assailant armor. A furious man with glasses had erupted into the carnage, launching burning strikes that scattered bodies and ignited clothing. After the final blast, silence fell, smoke and ash choked the street. Witnesses scrambled through debris as one pink-haired woman stared and whispered recognition. Crowds cried for the manager as a poster revealed Manager Leal. Bleeding, Manager Leal steadied himself and barked orders to prioritize the monsters amid the wreckage. A crystalline construct had torn the avenue and left survivors scattered. Masked figures had surged, and red blades had shredded assailant armor. A furious man with glasses had erupted into the carnage and launched burning strikes that scattered bodies and ignited clothing. After the final blast, silence had fallen, smoke and ash choked the street. Witnesses scrambled through debris while one pink-haired woman stared and whispered recognition. Bleeding, Manager Leal steadied himself and barked orders. The crowd then rallied and shouted revenge. Fighters charged into the wreckage. The pink-haired woman could not hold back and leapt forward, calling to save Horse King. A crystalline construct had torn the avenue and scattered survivors across the street. Masked figures had surged forward, and red blades had shredded assailant armor. A furious man with glasses had launched burning strikes that scattered bodies and ignited clothing. After the final blast, silence had fallen, smoke and ash choked the avenue. Witnesses scrambled through debris while fighters and bystanders moved toward the wreckage. Pink-haired woman stared and then rushed forward, calling to save Horse King. Manager Leal bled but steadied himself and barked orders that rallied the crowd. Nearby, a man cursed. The pink-haired woman fussed over a wounded figure with tenderness. Voices argued. One insisted the wounded was not a threat, while another scanned for the target. A crystalline construct had torn the avenue and left survivors amid cracked pavement. Masked figures surged, and red blades shredded assailant armor, while fighters launched burning strikes. After the last blast, silence fell and smoke choked the street. Pink-haired woman rushed the wreckage, calling for Horse King, while Manager Leal bled and rallied the crowd. The search pushed into a quiet moonlit forest and down to a glimmering stream. There a bloodied man rose and floated, face streaked with wounds. Onlookers froze at the helpless figure and feared the worst. The crystalline construct had fallen and loomed like a jagged monolith above the ruined avenue. Fractured cubes spun and emitted cold cyan light that cut the skyline and shredded building facades. Masked figures moved through smoke, while fighters and bystanders picked through the rubble for survivors. Pink-haired woman rushed the wreckage and searched for Horse King as Manager Leal bled and steadied the crowd. A wounded man later rose and drifted by a glimmering stream, his face streaked with blood. The air stank of iron and ash. A final golden pulse carried a blunt warning: the situation was serious. The crystalline construct had fallen and cast jagged light over the ruined avenue. Masked figures moved through smoke while survivors were pulled from rubble. Pink-haired woman rushed the wreckage and searched for Horse King as manager Leal steadied the crowd. Later, delegates gathered in the Hero Association executive chamber. They watched a global alert unfold across a floating grid and argued whether to call in cleanups or respond to a far higher threat level. Shadowed attackers coalesced beyond their systems, and a speaker warned that if they did nothing, Earth would be discarded. Profiles of available heroes flashed as alarms began to scream. The crystalline construct had collapsed, and jagged light cut across the ruined avenue. Masked figures moved through smoke, while survivors were pulled from rubble and pink-haired woman searched for Horse King. Manager Leal steadied the crowd as delegates gathered in the Hero Association chamber. They watched a floating grid of global alerts and debated response levels. A speaker warned that revelation to the Union would end the alliance. Profiles of available heroes flashed across screens as alarms began to scream. Outside, a bird landed among debris while two shadowed figures conferred and then prepared to leave. The neon facade glowed over a shattered avenue as alarms pulsed through the district. A lone figure stood on a rooftop, surveying the scene, while distant sirens and collapsing glass filled the air. Pink-haired woman showed exhaustion and determination in a close view as she spoke with a red-haired companion and a small group inside a makeshift command room. They exchanged updates, medical offers, and cautious gratitude while a younger recruit touched a wound and a faint healing shimmer answered. Plans for rescue and movement were made. Outside, shadows tightened and observers waited for the next signal. The page opened with pink-haired woman striking a heart-filled pose that drew cheers and teasing. A close panel cut to Cat pressing its head against a wounded man's torso. He semi-joked about mentorship and recovery. Conversation moved to the nature of their bond, framed as training that blurred personal limits. Online likes and mockery surfaced, then the mood shifted as red-haired woman watched from the sidelines. Her smile faltered, and she asked an urgent question that tightened the room. The scene ended on her trembling face and a silence that promised consequences. Petals fell as a silent page opened on a small lawn. A lone man crossed the grass holding a bright bouquet and walked toward an unseen target. He presented the flowers with trembling hope, and a hand reached to accept them. Bystanders lunged and ripped the bouquet away, shouting and throwing insults. One voice spat that he must never appear again. The man crumpled to his knees, clutching wounds and whispering that no one understood his love. Red-haired woman watched from the sidelines, her face frozen, and the page closed on his fierce, tear-filled eyes. Petals had fallen as a page opened on a small lawn. A lone man crossed the grass with a bright bouquet and offered it. Bystanders lunged, tore the flowers, and spat insults. He crumpled wounded and whispered that no one understood his love. A grinning masked man laughed with two women and taunted the ruined suitor. The suitor suddenly pleaded on his knees, begging to learn how to love. The crowd recoiled and muttered. The masked man turned and walked away. Red-haired woman watched from the sidelines as the page closed. Petals had fallen as a page had closed on a ruined suitor's plea. The grinning masked man left the crowd and sought a recruit nearby. He promised a transformed body and guided the young man to a crowded urban gym. He showcased sculpted muscles as evidence and promised elite overseas training from top schools. Dates fell like pages as grueling sessions reshaped the recruit's body and will. Small gains appeared alongside repeated pain and exhaustion throughout each marked week. At last he clenched his teeth and screamed with a feral resolve. Training had hardened the recruit's body and will over many brutal sessions. The grinning man unveiled a sculpted torso as proof and outlined the next phase. He struck the trainee as a test and spat a feral vow to make him an expert abroad. The trainee clenched and accepted the blow, then left the crowded gym into sunlight. A nearby smiling woman watched and mocked, then blushed from embarrassment. The quiet street suddenly shook as a thorn blossom erupted from the ground and a sharp object slammed down. Training had hardened the recruit's body and will through relentless sessions. Before the crowd, the grinning man unveiled a sculpted torso and presented proof. He struck the trainee as a public test, and the recruit accepted the hit. The trainee left the noisy gym and stepped into sharp daylight. A smiling woman watched, then flushed with embarrassment. The street then ruptured as a thorned blossom erupted and a sharp object slammed earthward. Chaos followed. A man begged for mercy, while another body floated unconscious in water. The crowd called it a failure and demanded answers. The grinning man confronted the outcome and pressed for explanation. A blonde onlooker stood stunned and asked what went wrong. Training had hardened the recruit's body and will through relentless sessions. Before the crowd, the grinning man displayed a sculpted torso and demanded a public test. The trainee accepted the blow and left the noisy gym into sharp daylight. A smiling woman watched, then flushed with embarrassment. The street ruptured when a thorned blossom erupted and a sharp object slammed earthward. Chaos followed as a man begged for mercy and another floated unconscious in water. The crowd called it a failure and demanded answers. A blonde woman threatened the grinning man and swore to kill him. Witnesses pleaded for the violence to stop and fled. Training had hardened the trainee, and the grinning man forced a public test. The trainee took the hit and left the noisy gym into bright daylight. The smiling woman watched and turned away. A thorn blossom erupted and a sharp object struck the street, causing chaos. Witnesses fled and a blonde woman vowed revenge. Inside, the crew argued they could not verify a locked room. She volunteered to search alone and swore she would not let him disappear. As she left, a sudden sound cut the corridor, and a shadowed figure appeared, freezing everyone. Training had hardened the trainee, and the grinning man had forced a public test which exposed fragile nerves. The noisy gym emptied into bright daylight as the trainee staggered away. A thorn blossom and a thrown object had already seeded chaos among witnesses. Heart King strode forward and played to the crowd, taunting and posing with practiced flair. He closed and unleashed a flashing pink assault called Power of Love that painted the air with hearts. The trainee and bystanders recoiled in shock. The page cut to a quiet corridor. An empty locker and a bloodshot, injured face hinted at danger. Heart King slipped into view and spoke with predatory delight, lips close to a man's ear. He unleashed a flashing heart-shaped assault that struck the man and forced a howl from the crowd. The bystanders reeled, and several more collapsed under the attack's sudden pressure. Pink-haired woman saw the assault unfold and recognized Heart King immediately without hesitation. She stepped forward through the fallen bodies, eyes wide, and called his name. Her voice cut through the din as she pushed between fallen bodies toward the scene. The page ended on her furious, unyielding face as she demanded an explanation and reclaimed the moment. Heart King closed the distance and pressed himself near pink-haired woman with smug intent. He whispered a teasing demand and kept his weight against her, disregarding the surrounding crowd. The contact drew gasps before he unleashed a bright heart-shaped assault into the crowd. People reeled and several fell into crumpled heaps from the blast's force. Pink-haired woman pushed through the fallen bodies toward him, fury sharpening her voice as she called his name. She met his attack directly and answered with her own concentrated energy. The two powers collided and scattered stunned figures across the ruined street. Heart King moved close and pressed his weight against pink-haired woman, demanding attention. He leaned into the crowd and then unleashed a bright heart-shaped blast. The blast knocked people down and left several crumpled on the street. Pink-haired woman pushed through fallen bodies toward him, fury sharpening her voice. She met his attack and answered with a concentrated counterstrike that scattered stunned figures. After the clash, Horse King stepped forward and seized pink-haired woman against his chest while complaining about the squeeze. He struck a theatrical pose and mocked the onlookers. Pink-haired woman met his theatrics with a cold stare and held her ground. After the scuffle, Heart King taunted from the crowd and asked if it was fun. A stunned man registered the question with wide eyes. He stepped forward as a red energy ripple formed behind him. The ripple swelled into a bright orb and struck. The man spun through the sky toward a blood-red moon. The taunter scorned him, asking if he had suddenly become a superhero. He added a jeer about being high and mocked alpha males. Pink-haired woman held her ground while onlookers staggered from the blast. After the scuffle, Heart King taunted from the crowd and challenged the spectacle. A stunned man stepped forward as a red energy ripple formed behind him and coalesced into a bright orb. The orb struck and flung the man through the sky toward a blood-red moon. The taunter sneered and mocked sudden heroics while onlookers staggered from the blast. Violence sharpened as a brutal strike sprayed blood across the frame. A grinning figure watched with hollow teeth, and a wounded fighter coughed an apology. A small group crossed the red shore beneath the moon, and one person collapsed. After the scuffle beneath the blood-red moon, the focus shifted to tighter frames. A taunting man spoke, and a wounded fighter clenched his jaw. He bit down on a metal tooth, and blood spattered across faces. The taunter laughed and goaded them further. The small group trudged across the red shore. One person peeled away and waded deeper into the liquid. Close-up split two faces into resolve and fear. A sudden strike came from behind, and bodies reeled. The scene ended on a raw confession and a stunned pause. He woke gasping beneath the red sky and insisted it must be a dream. He spat blood and bit a metal tooth as a taunter laughed nearby and goaded him. The taunter stepped forward and mocked his role as the main character, pressing for a reaction. The injured man struggled to stand while pain and rage set his face. Then a shadowed figure emerged from the gloom and spoke a name, Dave. The name hit the scene like a blow, and the wounded man reeled back in stunned silence. When the name landed, Dave opened his eyes to a blood-orange dawn above the city. Pain carved his features, but he forced himself upright and scanned the rooftop crowd. Shouts and metal screams filled the air as a transport skidded and crashed below. People dove for cover while someone screamed for help and ordered others down. Then a young woman plunged through the chaos and struck Dave with violent force. He reeled under the impact as bystanders converged and panic swallowed the rooftop. Silence fell for a beat as everyone registered the wounded man and the fallen stranger. Dave awoke to a blood-orange dawn and forced himself upright on the rooftop as a transport skidded and crashed below. People dove for cover and a stranger plunged into him, knocking him off balance.